Welcome to TaNaCh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Torah Talk Weekly Parshat with Rabbi Rafi Mollot, coming from his home. Right there, the man himself out of the Big H. Houston, Texas, welcome back. My dear friend, how are you today?
Good, I'm doing great. Great to be here. How are you?
I am doing very well. It's cold, but doing well. We've got a lot of...
How cold is it where you are?
It was 30. Last night, I think it dropped down to 22. With the
Wow.
That may have been with the wind chill, but for me, once it's below 40, it's like wind chill or not, is cold.
Yeah, here it's I think hovering in the 40s or high 30s. I'm looking at my weather app. It looks like it's 39 right now over here.
My Alexa on the desk says 31 currently. That doesn't register any wind chill, of course, but so we're below freezing just on raw temperature. So lots of icicles hanging off everywhere and frozen stepping stones. So we got to walk in the grass because we don't want to slide around. Take a risk.
I feel cold.
Take a risk on hurting ourselves. We can't go there. Oh, I know. Just the core, your core body temperature. Once that drops, it's just like you walk into a hot room and still need to turn the heater up higher to feel like it's giving you that comfort that you need in the freezing weather. So, well, very good. Well, Rabbi, welcome back. Parshat BeShalach. That's Exodus chapter 13 or 14. Yeah, actually 13, verse 17. Starting off with. So, I guess I'll pass this on along to you and let you teach us some stuff.
Okay, great. So glad to be here. Let me know if there's any issue with my audio, if I'm too loud, too quiet.
Nope, you're perfect. It sounds like a perfect mixture. Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So this parsha is so big. It's just so big. There is so much happening in this parsha. We have the Exodus from Egypt. It begins Vahi BeShalach Paro, when Pharaoh sent the nation out. BeShalach means, when he sent out. When Pharaoh sent out the nation, so we have the Exodus, and then we have the splitting of the sea, and we have the manna, the manna that fell from heaven to sustain the Jews in the desert, the people of Israel. We have the striking of the rock. There's just so much iconic events, so many iconic events in this parsha that it's really hard to know where to begin. And I don't want to disappoint anybody. My plan was really to focus on a point that I think most people look at rather trivially, but to me, I think nothing's trivial in Torah. That's not my opinion. That's a fact. But maybe we'll see how that is. That's something you might have overlooked. Is far deeper and more meaningful than it seems. So the parsha begins. It says, when Pharaoh sent out the nation, God did not lead them. This is in chapter 13, verse 17 of Exodus. God did not lead them the way of the land of the Philistines because it was close, because God said, lest the nation regret, lest the nation relent, change their mind when they see a war, and they will return to Egypt. That's. I'm looking at the verse in Hebrew. I'm awkwardly translating it into English. But in other words, when God took the Jews out of Egypt to go to the land of Canaan, the promised land, as it were, the straight way to go would have been through the land of the Philistines, which is along the coast. That would have been the quickest route. And yet, God took the Jews, he led them a circuitous route, a longer way, the scenic route, if you will, and the reasons given why. He didn't want to take them through the land of the Philistines because they might encounter a war over there, and when they see that there's the potential of a war in front of them, they're going to return to Egypt because it's close, because the distance because from the land of the Philistines to Egypt is very close. Think of, let's say today, the Gaza Strip is more or less where the land of the Philistines was. And it's right bordering the land of Egypt. So you would have gone through Gaza, as it were, and then the Gazans would have come out and tried fighting you. You might panic and head back to Egypt. It's right across the border, hop, skip, and a jump. So God didn't take them this way. He took them a different way, that they shouldn't immediately encounter a war, which also is in this week's Parsha. We have a war with, there's also so much. There's the quail, and there's a war with Amalek at the end of the Parsha. The nation of Amalek attacks Israel. That's the very end of the Parsha. But at least it came at the end, and they were a far enough distance away from Egypt and passing through the Red Sea and all these things that there was no opportunity for the people to run away. But if he would take them a short route and they would encounter a war, they might panic and try to escape back to Egypt. So it's a funny thing. It's a funny thing. Why is God so concerned that the people are going to see a war and run away? I mean, I did kind of explain it, but in other words, God can easily defeat the Philistines. He defeated Egypt. So, I mean, surely God's not worried, but it seems he's concerned. What are the Israelites worried about? What are they anxious about? And I don't want to make them anxious. I don't want to cause them anxiety, and they're going to run back. And at the same time, we have to ask the question, why after the Exodus, when they were oppressed by the Egyptians that were the mightiest empire for however many years, and God totally flattens Egypt in front of their faces, and takes them out, Yad Ramah, it says, with a uplifted arm, as it were, that they had literally the upper hand, the Yad Ramah, the upper hand. So they're going to be afraid of the Philistines. So what is going on over there? So in order to begin to unpack this mystery, and if things go well this hour, and I really shouldn't promise what's going to happen in the hour because it never goes the way I plan it, I want to hit a technical point first, and then I want to hit a more ethical point. So in order to unravel the mystery of why the Jews, the people of Israel, would have particularly panicked in front of the Philistines more than anyone else, that this was a real concern of God, that they would turn and run away. Now, you have to understand that when the Torah is telling us this, it's not like God didn't know what was going to happen, right? Like, I'm not sure, maybe it will, maybe it won't. This is basically telling us God knew that if they would go the way of the Philistines, the people would panic and turn back. That's what would happen. And therefore, God said, nope, right? Because he wasn't going to take away their free will and say, you may not. He knew it was something they couldn't stand up to. The question is why? So in order to answer that question, we have to ask another question, and we need to rewind a little bit to last week's Parsha. In chapter 12, verses 40 and 41 of Exodus, we have the following narrative. It says that the settlement of the children of Israel that lived in Egypt was 430 years. That's verse 40 in chapter 12. And then verse 41 more or less repeats it. It says, and it was at the end of 430 years, on that very day, the host of God left Egypt, right? So we have repeated two times in verse 40 and 41 that it seems to be saying, it sounds like it's saying that Israel was in Egypt for 430 years. However, upon close examination, that cannot be correct. That cannot be correct. And classically, Rashi in his commentary more or less spells this out. We have a count of every generation from the ones that went down to Egypt to the ones that left Egypt, exactly how many generations, who they were, and we know the length of their lives. So he said you had, for example, Levi comes down to Egypt. Levi comes down with three sons, arguably a fourth child also. One of Levi's sons is Amram. Then you have, his son, none of his sons is not Amram. He has three sons, Gershon, Kehas and Merari. Okay, he also has a daughter, Yocheved, who will be the mother of Moshe. Now, Kehas has a son, Amram. That's now the grandson of Levi. And it says Amram married his auntie, Yocheved. Okay, so Amram marries his auntie, Yocheved. But you have Levi, Kehas, Amram, and then Moses. So, and Moses emerges from Egypt within his lifetime. So Levi comes in within his lifetime. Kehas comes in within his lifetime. They have a child. There's a grandchild, Amram, who spends his entire life in Egypt, and his son Moses comes out. So the grandfather comes in and the grandson comes out. There's one generation essentially that's in Egypt for their entire lives. So Rashi says when you calculate the length of each one's lives and you line them up end to end, okay? And even if you throw Jacob in there also, who also went down to Egypt, Jacob, Levi, Kehas, Amram, Moshe, you take their whole lineage end to end. He says you get only 350 years. He says, and not only that, their lives weren't end to end. It's not like Levi was born the last day of Jacob's life, and Amram was born the last day of Kehas was born the last day of Levi's life, and Amram was born the last day of Kehas's life, and Moshe was born the last day of Amram's life, and Moshe spent all his years in Egypt, right? So he says it actually, if once you consider the overlapping years, it emerges that Israel was in Egypt for a total of 210 years. A total of 210 years. So what in the world is the Torah telling us when it says that the time that Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years? Okay? Seems like a very big mystery. So the explanation is not super mysterious, but it is mysterious. And that is the explanation that is offered here, is that it means it was 430 years when the Jews, in other words, if you look at verse 41, at the end of 430 years, they came out of Egypt. So the end of 430 years, from what? From what? It doesn't say what the beginning of the 430 years was. So it turns out, or here's what our sages offer, that if you calculate from the what's called the covenant between the parts, the bris bein habesarim, when God says to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, I think, he says to Abraham, yes, that's verse 13, he says, you should surely know that your offspring will be strangers, your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will serve them, and they will cause them to suffer. And then it says 400 years. 400 years, right? Now, you might remember from my class on Vayeshev, and if you don't, go back and listen to that class, that the patriarchs lived in the land of Egypt, in the land of Canaan, as what we would call Geirim, as sojourners, not as permanent settlers. And because they were Garim, they were living as sojourners, this living was counted among the 400 years that God says your seed will be strangers on a land that is not theirs. Because since the land of Canaan would not be possessed by them as permanent settlers until they entered the land following the Exodus, at that time the land was considered not theirs. So as long as they would sojourn in that land, they could fulfill or begin fulfilling already the 400 years. So the 400 years begin with the birth of Isaac when Abraham has seed. So the seed of Abraham, beginning with the birth of his seed until the Exodus, the birth of Isaac till the Exodus is exactly 400 years. So where's the other 30 years come from? The 30 years come from, you have to follow along, you got to hold on tight. The 30 years come from when you add the 30 years from the time that God announced this to Abraham until the Exodus is 430 years. So at the end of 430 years from the announcement to Abraham that his seed would be strangers in a land not their own for 400 years, right? From that announcement till the Exodus is 430 years. From the birth of Isaac till the Exodus is 400 years. Now, those of you who are paying close attention and know your scripture well, you're going to say that is incorrect. Because when Isaac was born, Abraham was how old? He was 100 years old. When we first hear about Abraham, well, it's not really clear how old he was when we first hear of him. However, in the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha, which is Genesis chapter 12, and I don't have the verse in front of me, but in the beginning of Genesis chapter 12, I really should look up the verse. In the beginning of chapter 12, it says that God tells Abraham to go from his place and travel to the land of Canaan, and he'll travel to the land of Canaan, and it says he goes, and he was 75 years old when he went. So if he was 75 years old when he left Haran to go to the land of Canaan, and following that, that's chapter 12, we have in chapter 15 that your seed will be slaves for 400 years, or they'll be slaves for 400 years. They'll be strangers, and also within that time they'll be slaves, etc. Not they'll be slaves for 400 years. They were only slaves for 86 years. So that's to take it even further. But Abraham had to be, presumably, at least 75 years old when he was told that, because that's in chapter 15, and we're told in chapter 12 that he was 75, which means from the announcement to the Exodus from Egypt couldn't have been more than 425 years, right? So that's what you would think, and that's what appears to emerge from the text. However, we have an oral tradition, and it is based on a careful reading of the verses. If you look carefully at Genesis chapter 12, which I want to look at, I want to bring up that chapter on my screen for myself. Genesis chapter 12 in the beginning, it starts out, God says to Abraham, Lech lecha, go for yourself from your land, etc. And it says in verse 4, and Avram went when God told him, or as God told him, and Lot went with him. And then it says, and Avram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Okay, when he left Haran. So listen to the verbs. And Avram went, vayelach. And then at the end of the verse it says, bitzei so, which is the verb when he left. To go is vayelach, and latzeit is to leave. When he went, Abraham went, as God told him. He was 75 years old when he left. Okay. Now in verse 5, it tells us. Okay. Now I'm going to read it again. I'm reading the verse. This is chapter 12, verse 4 in Genesis. This is a little bit of a deep dive, technical deep dive. And Avram went as God spoke to him, and Lot went with him. Okay. And Avram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Now in verse 5 it says, and Avram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, the son of his brother, and all their possessions, and the souls that they made in Haran, whatever that means. Not going to address that question now. And they left to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to the land of Canaan. Now this is very strange. If you're paying attention, it's very strange, because it's in verse 4, it tells me that he went, and he took Lot with him. The next verse, it says, he took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother, and all their property, and he left to go to the land of Canaan. So there seems to be not only an unnecessary repetition, but almost a contradiction. Because the first time it tells me he went, it says he went with Lot. And the second verse, it says he went with his wife and with Lot and with all his possessions. And they left to go to the land of Canaan. So why is it repeated? And why in the first verse it tells me Lot went, and the second verse it tells me his wife and Lot and their possessions and the souls they made, which essentially means the servants that they owned. Right? So there's two goings. One is Avram and Lot, and one is Avram, his wife, Lot, and also. So a careful reading tells us that there were actually two trips to Canaan from Haran. One was Avram just with Lot, who was his protege at the time, and he didn't take his wife, and he didn't take all his stuff. But later, that was what we call a pilot trip. It was a pilot trip. Then he came back, and then later he went with his whole family and his possessions, and they left to go to Haran. I hope I'm still with you. Anyway.
Yes, you're still good.
Okay, good. I don't know, something happened on my computer. I was worried I had a technical issue. Okay, so there were two goings. But when he left Haran, meaning he took all his stuff and he moved out, first trip he just went. He went for a pilot trip. But when he left Haran, which is really what happens in verse 5, that it says he left to go to the land of Canaan with his wife and Lot and his possessions and his servants, etc. He moved out. That's when he was 75 years old. And Avram was 75 years old when he left Haran. But the first going was not a leaving. It was just a going. There were two goings. He was 75 when he left, but he went one time before that. And how old was he when he went before that? He was 70 years old. And that is when the covenant between the parts took place. Now, you're going to say, wait a second, but it's totally out of order because the covenant between the parts takes place in chapter 15. And if you read now, and I told you in many previous classes, we have a concept called Ein Mukudam U'Me'uchar BaTorah. That means the Torah is not written in chronological order. Things are placed out of their chronological event order in order to emphasize certain ideas. I want to teach this idea first and then this idea second, and the juxtaposition and the changing of the order. It's all meaningful. And it all has to be examined to understand why the Torah shifts the order of its narrative. What is it teaching? There's a very, very basic principle. So I'll tell you, not everything's in order. That's out of order. Then you're going to say to me, but Rabbi, how could that be out of order? Let's take a look at the text. You have in chapter 12 that Abraham leaves Haran with his whole family. And then we have on verse 10 that there's a famine in the land and he goes down to Egypt, and the whole thing happens where Pharaoh abducts Sarah and then he's struck with plagues. Very interesting parallel. And then he sends Avram out. Very interesting parallel, because Pharaoh escorts Abraham out of Egypt at the end of chapter 12, just like Pharaoh escorts Israel out of Egypt in the beginning of our Parsha, BeShalach Paro. Okay, think about that. Okay, then it says in chapter 13, they came back into the southern part of Israel, and Abraham's traveling around, and there's a fight between Abraham and Lot among their shepherds, and they part ways, and Lot goes to Sodom, the city of Sodom. And then then we have chapter 14, and it says, and it was in the days of Amraphel, you have the war of the four kings, the four Mesopotamian kings against the five kings of Sodom and its surrounding cities. And during this war, Lot is captured. So we know that chapter 14 certainly takes place in order. Abram came to Canaan with Lot. They split up, right? They went to Egypt. Abraham became very rich. Lot became very rich. There were too many sheep. They couldn't live together. They fought over the land. They split up. Lot goes to Sodom. There's a war with Sodom. Lot's captured. It all follows a certain chronological order. And then Avram defeats the kings. He saves Lot. Then we get to chapter 15. And chapter 15 begins in verse 1 with the words, Achar hadevarim ha'ele, after these things. after these things. It's explicit in verse 1 of chapter 15 that chapter 15 takes place after chapter 14 in chronological order. And we just established chapter 14 in chronological order takes place after Avram moves to Canaan in his 75th year. So we're already moving forward from 75, and then we get to verse 13, and God says to Avram, "You shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in a land not theirs, and they will serve them," etc. It's in chapter 15, which clearly follows chapter 14, and here is the covenant between the parts. So you can't tell me that this happened before Abraham was 75 years old. So you can't tell me there were 430 years from here till the Exodus. Doesn't work. It doesn't work. I hope everyone's with me. I hope you see the magnitude of the problem. So I'm gonna now share something with you that you're certainly not going to expect, but hopefully you followed until now. And if not, listen again at the end of the class. Remember when I told you that the Torah is not written in chronological order? Well, usually it helps out that there are breaks in the text that indicate when things are out of order. Okay, there are breaks in the text, not that indicate when they're out of order, but in other words, once there's a break in the text, and we've described these breaks before, there's a space where there's just no text, and it's a wide space that indicates a section break, right? So when we divide the Torah into sections like that, it's easy to kind of chronologically shift the sections around, saying this section comes before that section, right? However, you remember from my class on Vayechi, go back to the class on Vayechi, that Parshas Vayechi is what's called a Parsha Stuma, a sealed Parsha, a closed Parsha. That was the topic of the class, the closed Parsha. But in other words, the reason we focused on it is because it's unusual that a Parsha, a Torah portion, will not have a break between it and the Parsha before. Why it's called the Parsha Stuma, a sealed Parsha, is there's no break in the text between the Parsha that precedes it, which is Vayigash. There's no break in the text between Vayigash and Vayechi. And yet our sages tell us this is a new Parsha, and yet, without a break. And so we said, why is it closed? Why is it closed? And that was the top of the class, because of the closing of the eyes and the hearts of Israel. Go look at that class, Vayechi. In other words, sometimes the section breaks are not apparent. They are hidden section breaks. And our sages revealed to us through oral tradition where these section breaks are. And as it would turn out, there is a section break in the middle of chapter 15. Now, what makes it a little less problematic is that the chapters are not a Jewish invention. We didn't make the chapters, okay? The chapter numbers were put in by Christians. Sometimes they correspond with the breaks in the text that we have. Sometimes they don't. We adopted the chapter numbers because they were convenient and helpful for reference. But there isn't actually, in other words, chapter 15, nobody said that it's a chapter. You know what I mean? But here's the fact. There is a section break at the end of chapter 14. At the end of the last verse in what's called chapter 14, there is a break in the text. And the beginning of chapter 15 does appear to be a new section. And there is no break in the middle. And yet our sages, and there's a break at the end before chapter 16. Yet our sages tell us, do you know where the cutoff is, where events cease to be in following Abraham's 75th year, and when they are a flashback to his 70th year? It happens, let's see if I could find it. It happens, yes, it happens between verse 6 and verse 7. So, in other words, verses 1 through 6 in chapter 15 is God appears to Abraham and he says, do not fear, I am shielding you, your reward is very great. And Abraham says, what can you give me? I'm childless, my servant Eliezer is going to inherit me, right? And God says to him, no, he will not inherit you. The one who will come forth from your innards will inherit you. And God took him outside and he shows him the stars and he says, so will be your seed. And it says, and Abraham, trusted God. Okay. Verse 7, it says, and he said to him, God said to Abraham, I am God that took you out of Ur-Kasdim. And I don't know if we pointed this out before, but there's a parallel language here between that and at Mount Sinai. I am God who took you out of Egypt, right? God seems to introduce himself as the God who has delivered you from something. I am the God who took you out of Ur-Kasdim, the Ur of the Chaldeans, which again our tradition tells us this was the furnace, and Ur means a furnace. God took Abraham out of a furnace. I think we spoke about this in a previous class, to give you this land to inherit it. And then they make the covenant between the parts. How shall I know that I'll inherit it? He tells them, take the animals, cut them in half, and he should walk between the parts. And then God sends his fire between the parts, pillar of fire. So this covenant between the parts, this section, and God said to Abraham, I am the God who took you out of Ur-Kasdim. This is a flashback to when Abraham was 70 years old. So this all happened when Abraham was 70. Indeed, that's when this took place. And now when we count from this event until the Exodus from Egypt, it's exactly 430 years. Now, as shaky as you might think this sounds, I'm going to tell you something that's going to blow your mind. We know, right, we have the Parshios. We have the Torah portions. And the Parshios were divided by the sages based on an oral tradition. In other words, they didn't make it up. This comes down. These are each parsha, as it were, has its own unique significance. We read the entire Torah on a cycle, finishing it in a year, and so on. Now, when we read the parsha, how do we read it? Okay, we go to synagogue on Shabbat, on Sabbath, Shabbos, and in the middle of the prayer service, we remove the Torah scroll from the ark. We put it down on this platform in the center of the synagogue or some location that it's easy to hear the reader. And we open the scroll. Now, we don't just have somebody go up and chant out the words from the scroll. Rather, the parsha is divided into 7 sections. Every parsha is divided into 7 sections, and we will call up to the Torah 7 individuals to, so to speak, read from the Torah. Now, it used to be Jews were more proficient in reading the Torah with its vowelization and musical cantillation without printed vowels or prompts. Nowadays, that's more of a specialty. So where it used to be, you could call up a random Jew in the synagogue and say, okay, now we're calling up Joseph, the son of Jacob. Come up and read the Torah, the first section of the Torah. We'll call up a Kohen first, someone who's a priest out of respect. We'll call him up first. Then we'll call up a Levite. Then we'll call up an Israelite. And we go through the 7 sections that way. Used to be each person would go up and read it for himself. Now, before and after the reading, there's a blessing. The person who's called up for his fraction of the parsha, his 1/7, will make a blessing before the reading and a blessing following the reading. And nowadays, we have a person who's generally an employee of the synagogue who is paid to be prepared to read from the Torah scroll. Again, a Torah scroll has no punctuation. It has no vowelization. It has no cantillation marks. It's just the plain word letters with no pomp and circumstance. But he has to be proficient in reading it with its correct vowelization, with its correct cantillation, knowing where the verses start, knowing where the verses end. And there's no printed indication of that. They're not printed. It's written. There's no written indication of that. So we'll call up someone to the Torah. He'll come up. He'll make the blessing. And the employee of the shul whose job it is to read from the Torah will be his emissary to read on his behalf. He'll read loudly to the entire congregation. when he finishes his section, the fellow who was called up for his, what's called an aliyah, his ascent to the Torah, he'll pronounce the blessing at the end of that section, and he'll sit down. Well, he won't sit down right away. He'll stand by. Another person will be called up. And it goes like that for the 7 sections, okay? So, if you had to guess where these 7 sections were in Parshas Lech Lecha, we're not going to go through where all of them are, but as it turns out, the section break for between the 5th and 6th sections of Lech Lecha is exactly between verse 6 and verse 7 in chapter 15. So that means we called up the 5th fellow for his section, and his reading stops at Genesis 15 chapter verse 6. They read for verse 6 and stop, and then the next person is called up to begin at 7. The break that I'm talking about, which is a hidden section break, is revealed every year when someone gets up in synagogue to read, and it seems to come right in the middle of the story. It sounds like one cohesive story of God promising Abraham that he will have seed. But as it turns out, there were 2 occasions where God promised Abraham he would have seed, and they're sewn together in the Torah because they are topically linked. Because these are the promises to Abraham that he will have seed, though the promise as it occurred in the order of the story, the way we were reading it, occurs up to that point, and then we have a flashback to the, again, original promise of seed, which happened when Abraham was 70 years old, and it follows immediately without a break. Without what I'm telling you now, you would not know that it's there, except it's revealed every time we read the Torah publicly by stopping. We stop after verse 6, and then the next individual comes to begin verse 7 to reveal, to show, to express, we are aware that these are actually 2 separate sections of text. And just as in Parshas Vayechi, we said with a Parsha Stuma, one Torah portion that runs right up against the other with no space in the text, it has to be explained. This hidden space also needs to be explained, and that's not my topic right now, but more or less it goes because God is, so to speak, about to reveal information about the redemption of Israel. Generally speaking, God does not want Israel to know when the redemption is going to be. It's supposed to come somewhat unexpected manner. So even though it's promised and there are clues to it in the text of when it will be, it's not something that's ever revealed openly. The exact time of the redemption is never revealed. So here the pronouncement between the parts, which would essentially predict when the Exodus would be, was concealed in the text because the redemption is, the time for the redemption is never meant to be known before it happens. So that's the reason that it was concealed over here. But after the fact, right, we all know. And so that fact that I'm telling you right now, there are other examples of this. Jacob, it says in Vayechi, at the end, when Jacob gathers his sons to tell them, it says, let me tell you what will be in the end of days. Let me tell you what will be. Gather around and I'll tell you what will be in the end of the days. And then if you read Jacob's speech to his sons, it's a series of blessings, and he does not reveal what will be in the end of days. So the commentators are puzzled. He says, let me reveal what will be at the end of days, and he doesn't reveal it. So Rashi, famously in his commentary over there, says Jacob wanted to reveal what would be at the end of days, and God said, because he had a prophecy of it, and God said, no, you don't. I don't want this information revealed to the children of Israel. And he removed that information from Jacob's mind. He obscured it, and he was unable to continue along those lines. And so he continued in a different manner. But that's why there's a non sequitur of gather and I'll tell you what will be at the end of the days. And he doesn't tell them because God removed that knowledge from his mind because he didn't want it revealed. Likewise, the time for the redemption presently is not known. The time of the redemption for Babylonia was concealed. Jeremiah said the exile will be 70 years. It'll be 70 years. 70 years from what? He doesn't say when the beginning point is. So Belshazzar, the emperor of Babylonia, who made a big feast, as you recall in the book of Daniel, Belshazzar, where he dies, the writing on the wall, etc., and then they're conquered by Persia, Media. Belshazzar believed that the 70 years began with the prophecy of Jeremiah. If we count from the prophecy of Jeremiah forward 70 years, that's the amount of time. And he was worried that God would redeem the Jews, which meant that the Babylonian Empire would fall because he's ruling over the Jews. So if God redeems them, what happens to him? When 70 years elapsed and the Jews were not redeemed from Babylonia, he made a feast to celebrate, so to speak, his defeat of the Jewish God. Of course, for that reason, he was punished and he's killed more or less immediately. And the Persians usurp. Now, the feast of Achashverosh in the 3rd year of his reign. What was the reason for it? The text doesn't tell us. In the 3rd year of his reign, this is in the book of Esther, Achashverosh makes a feast for 180 days, and then another 7 days in the city of Shushan. What was he celebrating? It doesn't say, just to show off his wealth. Why did he choose the 3rd year of his? What was the reason? What was the rhyme and the reason for this? So our sages tell us that, again, he felt that Belshazzar had miscalculated, and that, as a matter of fact, the 70-year prophecy of Jeremiah had not yet elapsed, that the 70 years actually began with the first stage of exile, which is mentioned in the book of Esther, that Mordechai was taken to Babylonia with the exile that was exiled in the time of King Jeconiah. There were different stages of the exile, but the first stage of the exile was 11 years prior to the destruction of the temple, and that was the exile of King Jeconiah and many of the aristocracy of Judea, including Mordechai. So Achashverosh was calculating 70 years from the exile of Jeconiah, and when those 70 years elapsed, he was celebrating similar to what Belshazzar was celebrating, that again the Jews had not been redeemed from Babylonia. That was the reason for the party. That's the reason that the rabbis did not want the Jews to attend the party, because even though they were invited, because it was basically declaring, we're acknowledging that our prophecy is not true, and so on and so forth. They did attend the party. That's the reason for the decree against them in the time of Purim. It's a whole other story we could talk about later. But the truth was that the 70 years that Jeremiah was referring to began with the destruction of the temple, 11 years following the first stage of exile, which was the second stage of the exile, and 70 years later it was rebuilt. So you see that the prophecy of 70 years was not revealed exactly when it began and ended. That the redemption was not meant to be revealed until essentially it would happen. And the same thing is true in the book of Daniel, where he reveals when the final redemption will be, is written in such a cryptic way that it is unknown. So much so that we have, I'm going to say the Talmud says, but it's a fact you could see with your eyes. We have Aramaic translations of all the books of TaNaCh, with the exception of the book of Daniel, and the Talmud records that. So we have the what's called the Targum, is the Aramaic translation of the Torah, which is written by a convert to Judaism who lived in the 2nd century, whose name was 1st or 2nd century. His name was Onkelos. Onkelos was a Roman convert to Judaism. He was a nephew of the Roman Emperor Titus, and he converts to Judaism, and he writes an Aramaic translation of the Torah. And it's printed in every single Chumash, if you have an art scroll Chumash. Any Chumash that you have, Chumash means the 5 books of Moses. Any Jewish edition of the 5 books of Moses that you're going to own will have in it, if it's a traditional printing, meaning from a traditional Jewish printing company. We'll have it in Rashi's commentary and Onkelos Targum Onkelos, the translation of Onkelos. We have on the books of the prophets a translation from a sage whose name was Yonasan ben Uziel, Jonathan the son of Uziel, who was a disciple of Hillel, who lived in the 1st century. So he's a little bit earlier. Ironically, the Targum means that the Targum on the prophets was written before the Targum meaning the Aramaic translation, on the prophets was written earlier than the Targum on the Torah, because Yonasan ben Uziel is earlier than Onkelos. Now, there's a question if Onkelos is the same person as Achilas. We have some sources that refer to Onkelos as having written in Aramaic translation, which is extant. We study it very regularly if we are a good Jew. And there's other stories of a translator named Achilas, who wrote a Greek translation. There's some question if Onkelos and Achilas are the same person based on similarity in their stories in our literature and similarities in the name. Onkelos, it's a little nasalized, but Onkelos and Achilas are very similar names. They were both translated. They were both converts. And in fact, some of Achilas's translation, Greek translation of the Torah remains. I forgot what it's called, but in English, it's called the hexagraphia. I forget. William, you probably know what it is, but he's known as Aquila, who wrote this Greek translation, portions of which we have, is Achilas, and maybe Onkelos may be the same person. In any event, the Talmud tells us that Onkelos wrote a translation of the Torah, and Yonasan wrote a translation of the prophets. It says Yonasan wanted to write a translation of the writings, the Ksuvim, the writings, that part of TaNaCh, right? TaNaCh is an acronym, Tav for Torah, Nun for Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Cha, which is also a Ka sound, is for Kesuvim, the writings. So he wanted to write a translation on the writings. It says that there was a great earthquake, and a voice emerged from heaven and said to Yonasan, "Why do you wish to reveal my secrets to mankind?" And essentially he was prevented from doing so. And the reason that the Gemara says, the reason the Talmud says, is because within the writings is the book of Daniel, and within Daniel is the secret of when the messianic redemption will be. And because that information requires to be unknown, he was prevented from writing this translation. Now, we do have translations for the books of the writings. They're not written by Onkelos, and they're not written by Yonasan. I'm not aware that we know who wrote them, but we do have them. They have come down to us through the ages. Someone at some point wrote Aramaic translations for the books of the writings. Okay. So, but those are just to go to the point of why there's a hidden break over here in Genesis chapter 15, concealing this information, is because the redemption, as a rule, the time of the redemption is concealed. Again, after the fact, we could look back and say, oh, there it was all along, but before the fact, it's concealed. So, therefore, that means that when Abraham was 70 years old, it was the covenant between the parts, and God said, your seed will be strangers in a land not their own for 400 years, and they will be slaves, and they will be made to suffer, and then they will emerge, etc., and etc., and etc. So it comes out that from the time of the announcement of this prophecy until the Jews emerge was exactly 430 years, and that's the meaning of those passages in chapter, what did I say the chapter and verse was? In chapter 12, verses 40-41, regarding the emergence of the Jews from Egypt at the end of 430 years, is 430 years from the announcement that they would go be strangers in a strange land, be slaves, etc., and then come out. It was all fulfilled at the end of 430 years from that prophecy. Okay, now, you can ask me the question, Rabbi, we're 8 minutes till the end of the hour, and what does this have to do with our parsha? So I introduced with this question, and I said, why does God not take them to the land of the Philistines? Here's why. Someone made a mistake. Someone made a mistake. And here was the mistake. Someone thought that when God told Abraham 400 years, at the end of 400 years, this would be fulfilled. They thought that this was 400 years from the covenant between the parts, not 400 years from the birth of Isaac. Remember everything I said in this class about the ambiguity of when a time frame is given. When does it start? When do I start the clock? Right? So after the Jews emerged from Egypt, we saw retroactively that the clock of the 400 years began with the birth of Isaac. But until that happened, it wasn't known. And somebody was really eager to leave Egypt. And somebody was waiting for those 400 years to be up. And they're watching the clock. And this group of people were the children of Ephraim. The children of Ephraim. The children of Ephraim, the tribe of Ephraim, were chomping at the bit to get out of Egypt. Why Ephraim of all the tribes? Maybe we'll have time to talk about it sometime, maybe not now. But as soon as 400 years were up, a group of Jews from the tribe of Ephraim escaped Egypt and entered the land of Canaan through the closest route that they knew. And the closest route that they knew was the land of the Philistines. A group of Jews left 30 years early, went to the land of Canaan through the land of the Philistines, and were decimated. They were slaughtered by the Philistines. And their bones were left out in a valley to dry. And if the Jews would have come through the land of the Philistines and been met with the bony remains of their fellow nationals, of their fellow tribesmen who were slaughtered by the Philistines, they would panic. They would say, God did not protect these Jews from the Philistines, and that means the Philistines are capable of defeating us. They did it before, and they'll do it again. And therefore, the Jews would run away. God knew this would trigger such a PTSD in the Jewish people that he knew they would turn back if they would see this. And therefore, he took them around. They're going to say, Rabbi, where are you getting this from? Where are you getting this from? So, in the book of Chronicles, 1 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 20 to 21, we have the account of the children of Ephraim, and it says that they were killed, these children of Ephraim were killed by the people of Gas. They were killed by the people of Gas. Gath, 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 is a city in the land of the Philistines. Now, how in the world did the children of Ephraim get killed in the land of the Philistines if they were in Egypt? If they were in Egypt. So the only answer is the children of Ephraim emerged from the land of Egypt during the period of the enslavement, and they were cut down by the people of the land of the Philistines at that time. There was an early emergence. They attempted to enter through the land of the Philistines, and they were killed. The Talmud tells us openly about this in Sanhedrin 92b, citing this passage in the book of Chronicles. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the Targum, the Aramaic translation on that verse, which I wish I had in front of me. Let me see if I could bring it up on Safaria really quick. Can I bring it up on Safaria? Targum on this verse.
What is
Bear
that?
with me.
I'll look it up on my side too.
Targum on Chronicles, chapter 7, verse 21. Let's see.
There it is.
Okay.
You said First Chronicles.
Okay. If you look in the Targum over there on Chronicles 7, verse 21, it says, and Zavad, the son of Zavad, his son, meaning the son of Ephraim. Am I in the right verse? It's 20 and 21, right? Yeah. So in verse 21, and Zavad, his son, the son of Ephraim, and Shuselach, his son, and Ezer, and Elad, I'm skipping a little bit. Okay, it says they calculated. Now, this is the Aramaic translation. Now, when I say translation, you have to understand that it's an interpretive translation. So the interpretive translation of this verse adds in the details that I've been describing to you in the following way. It says they calculated the end of time from the time that God spoke with Abraham between the parts, at the covenant between the parts, and they erred. I'm translating the Aramaic right now, extemporaneously. And they erred. They made a mistake. They made a mistake because they should have counted. This is all the words of the Targum. Because they should have counted from the day that Isaac was born. And they left Egypt 30 years before the end. This is all Aramaic. I'm just translating it. He says, because 30 years before Isaac was born, the master of the universe spoke with Abraham between the parts, and when the Jews, and when they emerged from Egypt, it was Alpha and yeah. It says, and I'm skipping a little bit, and it says, and the people of Gas killed them. Okay, so in other words, I just read the relevant parts of that. This is an interpretive translation. Okay, they shoved a lot into that verse, but to explain what's going on in this verse, the translator went in and added all these details and said this whole story in the book of Chronicles of the sons of Ephraim entering. This was a group of Jews that went in 30 years prior to the Exodus because they were awaiting the redemption, and they counted from the time of the covenant between the parts rather than from the birth of Isaac. Regarding this, the Talmud says, asking on Ezekiel chapter 37, the valley of dry bones. He says, where was the valley of dry bones and whose bones were they? The Talmud asks. And there are different suggestions. But one of the suggestions is that these were the bones of the children of Ephraim that entered the land of the Philistines by leaving Egypt 30 years earlier, when it was not yet the time for redemption, and therefore they were unsuccessful, and the Philistines slaughtered them and left their bones to dry. Now, you see that they were ultimately rewarded for their zeal of wanting the redemption, of yearning for the redemption. And they made a mistake, and it wasn't the redemptive time, so they were not successful in achieving their goal. But later on, they would be these men would be resurrected hundreds of years later by Ezekiel himself. So hundreds of years, 1,000 years later, by Ezekiel himself, they would be resurrected. They would actually merit to resurrection, and they would live again, and they would go to the land of Israel, and they would have children. And one of the sages in the Talmud there identifies himself as a descendant of one of those men who were resurrected in the time of Ezekiel. Could you imagine? You had living people saying, that was my great-great-grandfather. Mm-hmm. I know exactly who the people were in the valley of the dry bones because I'm a descendant of that person. This was very real. This was very known to the Jewish people throughout history. So, this is the missing information. I said it's a little bit technical. This is the missing information that is required to understand why God took the Jews around a circuitous route rather than taking them through the lands of Pelishtim, because he knew that they would not be able to have the courage to go through the land where their brethren had been slaughtered only 30 years earlier, seeing the remains left out to dry. They would encounter the skeletons of their brethren, and they would lose their hope, and they would turn away. And rather than cause this panic and PTSD, God says, guys, we're going a different way. We're going a different way. There was a lot of information, right?
Mm-hmm.
But look at all that in one verse. To understand one verse, you have to know the whole TaNaCh. You have to know the whole TaNaCh to understand one verse in TaNaCh. Now, I said I wanted to speak on an ethical point, and I know it's the end of the hour. I was going to say much, much, much more, but I'll say this. The Shelah says, the Shelah is it's a beautiful work of Torah. It covers so many areas. You can't really call it a commentary. It's a beautiful work of Torah. The acronym Shelah, Shin Lamed Hey, stands for Shnei Luchos HaBeris, the 2 tablets of the covenant. That's what he titled his work. It's written by Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz, who lived in the 17th century. And there's so much in there. But part of it is a commentary on the Torah. And in his commentary on this Parsha, he says the following thing. He says, look how God created a fence for the Jewish people. He said, I want you to go to the land of Israel. The quickest way is through the land of the Philistines, but I don't want to trip you up. I don't want to cause you to fail. So I'm going to create a fence, and it makes it a little bit harder, and you have to go around a little bit of a longer route. But I'm safeguarding your well-being, and I'm creating a fence around danger. I'm creating a fence around danger. We're going to go around. He says, God himself made a fence over here. And this is somewhat related to the principle of how the sages learn from God's own actions that you have to make a fence for the Torah. We know the rabbinic laws are laws that sort of add a little bit of stringency onto things that the Torah technically permits, but dabbling in them may lead one to accidentally break a Torah command. So they take us one step back and they say, listen, let's be careful around here. We know this is the danger zone. Let's go a different way, right? Let's not dance on the precipice of danger. But more than that, I heard from my Rebbe, Rav David Kaplan. He said what a person needs to learn from here, and I'm relating it to the Shla because for me it's reminiscent, is a person should never put himself into a test, into an area where he's going to be tested that he may or may not break one of the Torah's commands. He gives a mundane example. He says, a guy goes out to a bar, he has a few drinks, and he loses a little bit inhibition, and he commits several sins, whatever they might be. Use your imagination. So he says, you know what? I drank a little too much, and then I was confronted with these tests, and I failed my tests. So Rabbi Kaplan said it this way. He says, no, you don't fail the test. You don't fail the test when after you're drunk, right? And then the test comes in front of you, and that's not when you fail the test. And you didn't even fail the test when you started drinking. You failed the test when you walked into the bar. When the thought came into your mind, I want to go out to a bar and have a good time, that was the point you should have said, no, what's wrong with going in and having a few drinks? I'm not sinning, right? And then afterwards, the sin comes along and you don't hold yourself back. Where did you fail? Was the failure when you sinned? He says the failure was several steps before that when you walked into the bar, even though there was no sin necessarily in doing that. But a person needs to know, where is the danger zone? Should I enter this way or should I go around? Even though it's not against the rules, technically speaking, but am I setting myself up for success or am I setting myself up for failure? Every person needs to look at their life and the situations in their life and the relationships in their life and the people in their life and the places in their life and the decisions they're making. And before they put themselves, if I go to this place, if I hang out with this person, if I look at this or that, am I going to be tempted? Well, temptation doesn't equate to a sin. But what if the temptation leads me to a sin? So when did I fail? Did I fail when I sinned, or did I fail when I chose to put myself in a place that I knew there would be a temptation? Rabbi Kaplan looked at this verse and said, God said, I recognize where the danger is, and I'm teaching my children, you don't go where the danger is. Nothing happened yet. It's not the war yet. I didn't wait till they saw the war and then had to choose fight or run, right? We're not going that way. We're going a different way. It's longer. It's more of a schlep. It's less convenient. It's you go the safe way. And everything in your life, you should be looking before problems come up. Is this choice going to lead me towards a temptation, or is it going to keep me safe? You got to think several steps ahead. Don't teeter on the fence of what's allowed, what's not allowed. Think about the situation. Is this situation going to lead to a temptation for me personally or not? You got to be smart about it. I'm gonna just say one more thing and then I'm gonna sign off.
Okay.
Which is this.
Sure.
In Parshas Ki Sisa, which is in Book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21, we have the law regarding the rebellious son, the Ben Sorer Amora, the wayward and rebellious son. And it talks about this boy. He doesn't listen to his mother. He doesn't listen to his parents. They discipline him, and he rebels, and he eats meat, and he drinks wine, and he gets drunk, and they take him to court, and they basically stone him to death, right? They stone him to death. Now that seems rather harsh. Now, mind you, we spoke about death penalties in another class, and what the meaning of the death penalties are. They're largely academic, and they're mainly to convey the severity of a sin, and they almost never implement them. And this is also one of the cases where the Talmud says this was never done. In other words, the criteria for everything that's required to qualify as the textbook Ben Sorer Morer is so narrow that you're essentially never gonna meet it. But it is a cautionary lesson, and the question is, what is that lesson? He has to be a certain exact age, 13 and a half years old. He has to eat an exact amount of meat, and everything has to be exactly according to the script, and that never happens in real life. But the purpose of this section is to teach us a principle. And what is that principle? So I'm going to share with you what my Rebbe said about this. And by the way, there are several death penalties spoken of in the Torah. We're not going to go through that now for lack of time. There's 4 different variations of the death penalty. Arguably, stoning is the most severe, meaning it's the most horrific and painful. So the question is, you're going to take a young 13-year-old kid and you're going to stone him. What did he do? He didn't murder. A murderer gets the death penalty by chopping off his head. That's pretty quick and painless compared to stoning a kid who didn't do anything like that. So the sages say the following. They say they're stopping the boy from the path that he's headed on. By looking at a boy who is fulfilling these criteria, the Torah is predicting a path. This boy is going to become a thief. He's going to become a murderer. He's going to become a danger to society. And we need to remove the danger before any innocent people get hurt. He's informing us well ahead of time of where his trajectory is, and he needs to be removed for the picture. Okay, I understand, to some degree, that rationalization of, okay, he's a danger to other people. He's going to end up murdering. We have to stop him, and this is what it takes. But such a severe, of all the death penalties, a murderer himself, we remove it, we kill him with a sword. But this guy, you're going to break every bone in his body by stoning him. That's much more painful. So why is it so severe? And again, it's academic, but the principle that being taught of the severity of what he's doing versus the severity of a murderer, which is very severe, is that for the capital crimes for which there are severe death penalties, let's say even an adulterer is suffocated to death. There's a lot less pain involved. So the idea is that when a person is caught up with his passion and sins as an act of passion in the moment, you're so angry that you kill a person, God forbid. You're so inflamed with lust that a person commits a illicit sexual relation. It's awful. It's terrible. It's immoral. It's indefensible. It's all of those things. And if it would be fulfilling all the strict requirements for a death penalty, which is almost impossible, on paper it deserves the death penalty. However, the Ben Sora More is several steps ahead. He's at a point where he's not acting out of passion. He's not the murder that we see in his future. He's at a point several steps ahead where he could totally short circuit that. He's not right now enraged to murder. He's right now inflamed to commit a capital crime. He's at a point where we're telling him your actions are going to lead in this direction. You need to stop. Before you're ever captured by passion in such a way that's almost uncontrollable, you're in way more control of your actions right now. Choose while you're several steps back, while you're way more in control, not to put yourself on the trajectory to that terrible sin. And if you can wave away that warning with your full wits about you and say, I don't care that I'm going to end up over there. I am going to walk down this road. So a calculated choice to move towards a capital crime when one isn't in the moment inflamed with passion, but is at the stage where they have more control over their intellect and can choose something different, it's far more severe. It's far more severe. That's to say, with all my faculties about me, I'm choosing with my full wits about me to head in the direction of a capital crime, knowing that's the trajectory, knowing I've been warned, is far more severe than a person that commits it in the moment out of passion. So yes, those people who commit those crimes, the Torah has heavy penalties for them, but there's a certain leniency for the fact that part of that wasn't totally within your control. When we step back several steps, it's totally within our control, and we still choose it. That's much more severe. It's much more severe. So the same thing over here, the idea of God says, I'm not going to put you in a test. I'm not going to put you in a situation that you're not prepared for. But a human being, God's not going to do that. God will never give us a test that we are not prepared to pass. It doesn't happen. And it could be very hard. But if you understand that if God put us in this situation, we have the capacity to endure it. But a person says, no problem, I'll go to a bar. I'm giving them a mundane example, whatever it is. I'll look at certain imagery that maybe is not so modest. I will, whatever it is, go to a place where, whatever. Nothing's going to happen. You're putting yourself in a test that you don't know you can endure. So then when the test comes along and you flop and you fail, you have no one to blame but yourself. You can't say, well, God put me in a test and I failed it. God didn't put you in that test. I couldn't have overcome it. It's too much for me. God didn't put you in that test. You put yourself in that test. God's not going to take you into the land of Philistines if there's a war there that you can't stand up to. Not going to do it, taking you guys around. We have to do the same thing. We have to recognize that we don't know what tests we can pass and what tests we can't pass other than the ones God hands to us against our will. He says, this is your time to step up. This is your time to grow. You need to push against resistance. Push, push, push. Now's the time. Push now. We don't know how to calculate that. So we need to think several steps ahead and look, these choices in my life, are they going to lead me to a place where I am going to be equipped to succeed as a human being in my mission on this earth, or where I'm going to be tempted? And not to say to myself, I can overcome temptation. That's no problem. You'll have no one but yourself to blame in the end. The fault is going to lie with you. So let's learn from this verse. God took them around the land of Philistines. He says, I know you can't endure it. We have to be as smart, knowing that we don't know what we can and can't endure, to avoid putting ourselves as much as possible into a test. And with that, I'll pause for the week. Thank you.
That works. William. Yes, sir. No problem at all. And message for me in that one was, just because it's happening doesn't mean God put me there. I might have put myself there. So
right. That as well.
That's a big lesson. That's a big lesson, no doubt. Good deal. Okay.
Yeah. So just to reiterate, the first load of the class, which was a very deep dive that was kind of technical. I encourage people to listen to it again to fully grasp all that material, but I thought it was a very interesting piece of background looking from the larger scope of TaNaCh to understand what it means in this verse that God took them away from the land of the Philistines because they might see a war and run away. Seems very out of place, but with all the information I've given you, it makes total sense. Okay, that's it.
Very good. Thank you all for tuning in. Rabbi, we'll see you at the same time, same place next week, Hashem willing. And until then, you guys stay warm, depending on where you're at. Take care, everybody. Peace.
Shalom, my dear friends. Hope this message finds you well. If you like the way this channel is going, and the channel has been a blessing to you, please consider supporting the channel by going to the website, TaNachTalk.com, TANACHTALK.com. Thank you once again for your time and for supporting TaNaCh Talk. Shalom.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה